Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to discuss the maximizing efficiency and enhancing digital employee experience, return on investment through strategic hardware asset management. Mouthful, a lot there. There's a lot to discuss in this. This is a conversation that we've been having quite a bit over the last 18 months or so with our customers. I'm very excited today to be joined by some experts in the field to discuss it. Some business up front. If you have questions about anything that we have going on, throw those in the chat, and we'll look at those at the end of the presentation. So if you have a question, throw them in. We'll have a Q&A session at the end where we'll go through the questions and answer those the best we can. So stick around all the way through the end to make sure that you hear your question answered. Otherwise, we'll flow through the webinar and discuss this topic together through just a natural conversation. With that, let me kick it off and introduce who we have participating today. So my name is Josh Thompson. I am the Vice President of Product Marketing here at 1E. And I'm joined today on the 1E side by Jason Keogh, the Vice President of Solutions. This man is the technical genius of 1E. He knows it all. He's seen it all, especially in this concept. He's been around a long time. He knows what's going on in this space. He spends a lot of his time working on this and thinking through these problems. Together from the 1E side, we're going to bring our expertise, but I'm going to hand this over, and I'm going to let our two participants, our effectively customers, introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their role in their organization, what they do, and set the stage for everybody here on the webinar today. All right, with that, our participants today are David Todd and Tim James. David, can you kind of set the framework for everyone here, give us your background, and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Director of IT and DEX at 1E, and I'm a customer of 1E as well, because we're customer zero. So, we always like to take on our products, test them on ourselves, validate them, make sure we're getting value before sending them out to the rest of the marketplace. So I'm really invested in this whole topic. And over the years that I've been in IT, which are far too many for me to talk about, so I'm not committing anything to film here. I've always seen the value of making sure that people have the right hardware to do their jobs and how this affects the digital employee experience. And it's not always just about crunching the pennies. We'll talk about ROI. There are different ways that we can evaluate ROI. So I think I've got something to bring today, and I'm interested to see what the questions are and also hear Tim's opinion on them.
Tim, great to see you again. Thanks for participating today. Same thing, Tim. Do you mind giving us your background and setting the stage for everybody here?
Yeah, hi everyone. Tim James, based out of Cape Town in South Africa. Maybe just a bit of my background. Spent much of my early career in IBM Global Services in both their consulting and managed services divisions. And then in 2008, I co-founded Sustainable IT. Kind of as the name implies, we, in the early days, focused quite heavily on sustainability and IT. Very much towards data center efficiency, energy efficiency. And that's really how we became partners of 1E, with 1E's Night Watchman solution, which was around power management. Our value proposition has morphed a bit over the years. We now focus more heavily on IT efficiency, and hence our partnership with 1E has really grown over the years, and we've deployed and managed all of 1E's technologies that they've released over the years. So yeah, that's a bit about me. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Great. And thank you everyone for participating. All right, let's kick it off. We'll kick it off with the first question for discussion today, which is, and I'm going to start, I'll give you a heads up here. Tim, we'll start with you, but I'll read it out and we'll go to you. What is the relationship between hardware asset management and digital employee experience? Like, how do you see that? What does that mean to you and your customers?
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I could just dial it back a touch. I think for me, there's a bit of a misnomer in the industry around what DEX is. I think for many people see DEX as data and pretty dashboards, and And I see it in a very different way. Unless we're taking actions based on that data and actually physically improving the end user experience, it's not DEX at all. It's all well and good to have data, but really DEX is around the actions that you do with that data. And I think that's where hardware asset management dovetails quite nicely with DEX and the data you can get out of DEX platforms. So if you can take data-driven decisions around how you provision hardware, who should be getting what, how you support that hardware, you can obviously then improve end user experience, and you can effectively reduce downtime, you can improve employee productivity, and also just ensure that devices are compliant and secure. So I think that's where the relationship interlocks quite closely. Obviously, we get a lot of data out of DEX tooling, and with HAM, that data becomes valuable, but only if we take action.
Yeah, great, Tim. That's a great perspective. David, I'd like to hear, as a practitioner yourself, I'd like to hear your thoughts here, and then we'll go to Jason, who's in the product world and really thinking deeply, in a global sense about these topics. So, David, like, how do you see this relationship?
Well, I think Tim raised one of the key points, which is about data-driven decisions. So we can't just say, well, this piece of kit is 4 years old, needs to be replaced. And I'm sure we'll touch more on this as we go, because this is a key driver for our hardware asset management and how it affects the experience. And also, just because someone is doing a role they were given the day they got given that asset, doesn't mean they're doing exactly the same role nowadays and that asset is appropriate. So we need to be constantly evaluating our hardware management, seeing, is this thing appropriate for them and their digital employee experience right now?
Yeah, great. Yeah, great points there. The data-driven decisions, Tim, your point about not just all the data, but actually how do you affect change? Jason, how do you see that all coming together? What's your perspective here in this relationship between the two?
So, I mean, hardware asset management is all about making sure that people have the right hardware to do their jobs and that you're managing that hardware through its life cycle. And there's nothing more impactful to your digital experience as an employee than the device that you use for all that digital stuff, right? So your laptop or your desktop, your mouse, your keyboard, these are the most direct connections you literally have to that digital world. So hardware asset management and DEX go together like ham and cheese. It's they're part that not actually part of one another, but they're both better when you bring them together. So yeah, I mean, ham is as David has already said, deciding to replace a machine based on its age is nonsense. Deciding that a machine is appropriate for the user based on the spec without considering what the user actually wants or needs to do or actually does is also kind of nonsense. So if you can get the right machines to the right users and replace them in the right way at the right time for the right reasons, then that's good digital employee experience. And it's the most critical thing to it, is the device.
Yeah, I mean, the device is obviously critical, right? Like without it, like that's the interface to the experience, especially in the way that the world works these days. So, but for the next question, I'm going to start this one with David, give you a little heads up here. I'll read through it. But let's talk about the hidden costs before we get into kind of the details of hardware asset management. So the question here is, what are the hidden costs associated with poor hardware asset management? What are those hidden costs to the organization?
Well, there's two key streams that I see. One is, of course, the effectiveness of the employee. We're talking about, and Jason just made it clear, the appropriate device for that person based on what they're specifically doing. And so there's an opportunity cost loss when they can't work effectively. But I think also the hidden costs really sit sometimes with the IT teams trying to manage their devices. And if you don't have a good hardware asset management strategy in place, you're not doing things effectively, people are running around wasting time, rebuilding machines, sending machines out that are then not appropriate. And those costs just accrue and accrue. And of course, if I've got my IT team spending their time doing that, they're not doing what they should be doing, which is enabling all the other people within the organization to do their jobs to the best of their ability. And I think that often gets overlooked. Just what is that impact on your internal IT teams?
Yeah, I mean that's a good point, is the impact on the internal IT teams. Jason, to put you on the spot a little bit here, and then we'll go to Tim. Jason, like, where do you see that? What are you seeing when you're talking to customers and you're doing the specs for the product?
Yeah, so I mean, beyond those points, so absolutely the knock-on effects of having the wrong device is, you have people, we've seen, for example, people that they're hammering their devices. They are they have a device, they might have had it for a short time or a long time, but it's not appropriate for them because they are hitting the CPU continually. The machine is not keeping up with the user, essentially. It wasn't the right sort of sized machine for that user in the first place. And that user can't be as productive as that user should be. And also that user is getting frustrated. There was a statistic we saw, it was a year or more ago, from Gartner, about the level of which of there's a certain percentage of people who who essentially rage quit from their typically good paying sort of white collar jobs because of anger with their IT department, essentially, and often with their devices. This bloody thing doesn't work. I'm out of here. This company's a joke. I'm not working for these guys anymore because they can't even give me a machine that works, right? And it isn't often necessarily about the machine that works. It's about they got the wrong machine in the first place. Shouldn't even have that type of machine. They should have something completely different. And that's a hidden cost. You're not thinking of the HR impact of giving users the wrong machines, but there is, for 10 or 15% of people that quit, not a huge percentage of them, but there are certain people who quit because this machine just drove me crazy. I've been putting up with it for the past 6 months. It's crashed again, or it won't boot again, or it's so slow again. That's it. I'm quitting. I'm out of here. I'm sick and tired of it. And they just leave. And there's all sorts of hidden costs, not just productivity. And then that has impacts all across the board in terms of hiring and training and getting new people into place and so forth. So there's unforeseen costs, for sure, of not getting the right kit to the right people.
Yeah, I mean the costs start to add up over time. Tim, in your real life experience of implementing these things and helping customers with these things, what's your perspective? What do you see here?
Yeah, I mean, David and Jason have focused very much on the end user, so I don't want to kind of beat on that drum. But if we just look at the device in particular, if you're not doing hardware asset management very effectively, one of the hidden costs could be redundant purchases. So if you don't have accurate inventory of what you've got, you may be unnecessarily spending money on hardware. You could also be unnecessarily spending hardware because you've got spending money because you've got arbitrary refresh cycles. We have touched on that. We'll probably touch on that a little bit more as well. And then the other thing is underutilization of assets. If you can track utilization of assets and potentially put them in more appropriate hands, again, that's a hidden cost that you're just leaving on the table. So those would be my views, kind of over and above what David and Jason have mentioned already.
Let me shift. There's when we were developing our device refresh solution, we did all this analysis on the machines and blah 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 blah, and we came across a scenario where somebody essentially that had been in reception in 1E, they don't need big bulky machines, they don't need lots of power, they don't need anything, but they had a ridiculously powerful machine. They kept them coming up as having, to your point, Tim, they had a machine that was way overspec'd. And essentially they had a machine with like 64 gigs of RAM and an 8-core beast of a Xeon processor and blah, blah. This machine cost $4 or $5 grand. And they were maybe browsing the internet on it and occasionally opening the odd Excel file. And it was like, and I actually spoke to some people and said, how did that person end up with that machine? That's a crazy machine. And the answer was, one day their machine just died, and this was the machine that we had lying around that was available, and we just gave, and this was clearly a device that we spent like $5 grand on because we were going to give it to a developer who needed all that grunt, but we just gave it to somebody who needed a device because their device had gone poof, right? So now 6 months, 8 months, whatever it was later, the person that's on reception still has the developer laptop, right? I don't think there was a developer, using using someone from reception's laptop, but we could have I'm sure the normal machine we would have given to that person was 1.5 grand. We'd spent 3 grand more on that device, and that's a hidden cost. It's essentially a waste. We were able to see that, and I don't know if we did switch machines with the person post fact, but we're able to see that kind of thing when you look at the data. When you have data-driven decisions, you can see things, and then you can go, how did that even happen? And sometimes you find out, and there's a little story behind it, but there's a reason typically, but it's not necessarily a good reason, and it's certainly not a good reason to leave that device with that person. Instead of buying a new 4.5 grand laptop, buy a new 1.5 grand laptop, give it to the person on reception. They'll love their new shiny laptop, and it'll still work for them incredibly appropriately to do all they need to do. And we can take that device and give it to a developer and save ourselves 3 grand in doing so, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's a great story. Yeah, it seems like everybody's answers here really boil down to a proper utilization of assets, right? I mean, I think it's all our jobs and in every company to utilize assets the best we can, whatever it may be, hardware or otherwise. And that seems to be the condensed of what we're all saying here. For those online, those watching live, please remember, throw questions in the Q&A, and we'll address those at the end. But let's press on. Let's press on to the next question. I'm going to start this one with Tim. You're up next. So Tim, let's start with you. So what are the key components of an effective hardware asset management strategy that considers digital employee experience?
Okay, so here I am going to focus on data. I think a couple of things, and I'm not going to touch on all of them, but I think real-time inventory management is quite critical. We often rely on solutions that do periodic scans of what is out there, and often that data becomes obsolete very quickly. And if you've got real-time inventory, you can reduce errors significantly. You can also reduce kind of mean time to repair, because you know where things are, what is on that device, what peripherals are on there, how much memory is in it, etc. So it's quite important to have that real-time view of the world, in my opinion. And then obviously around the devices themselves, understanding how those devices are performing is critical to provide a DEX solution that gives you a view of how that employee is perceiving their device. And then obviously, again, the analytics around how that user is using the device contributes to how you can actually deliver your service. So those, to me, from a pure data point of view, would be the key things that you'd want to consider when you're looking at DEX and hardware asset management together.
Yeah, those are all great points. David, you're on the front lines of it. You're doing it every day. Do you see similarities, or what's your view here in this connection?
Well, there's certainly that, but I'd also add in the people aspect, and that's again with two focuses. One, we've got to look at our own internal teams and tell them how important this is, because often it's thought of as a chore. Updating an asset system, an asset comes back, I have to do something with it. I tell you what, I'll put it to one side and deal with it later. We know that doesn't work, right? And as soon as an asset system starts to get a little bit out of sync, it can lose quite a lot of validity, and it makes it much harder to bring it back to where you were before. And I always impress upon my teams how important it is to keep that running and accurate all the time. Equally, and this may seem a bit of an odd one, it's communicating to your organization about your asset strategy, your hardware asset management, in that, well, look, Jason isn't using this device as much as he wants, or for whatever reason, he thinks that Tim's device would be better suited to him. So they decide to swap. And, and this happens frequently, not in our company, of course, we've stamped that out. But, I've seen that in lots and lots of places, lots of different organizations. And as far as the end user is concerned, there's nothing wrong with that. Tim's still got a device, Jason's still got a device, but it really messes it up for us. So we need to ensure that through our onboarding, through our constant IT engagement with teams, with people within the company, they understand what their hardware asset management responsibilities are as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Jason. Yeah, let's hear it. What do you think? What's your responses there? How are you?
You
How are
can't
you?
have my machine, Jason.
Yeah, I'm gonna fly down to Cape Town just to get it. So so basically, I mean the foundational for anything is data, right? Which Tim pointed out, and you know, data includes things like who is the user and what is the device and which users have which devices. You know, that's absolutely foundational. But you know, from an effective ham strategy point of view, I think there's stuff that's often not thought of, that you know we have the data for and we can play with. So, for example, and it's focusing on the effective piece rather than a ham strategy. You know, it is this device, this particular individual's device, is it a good device? You know, compared to other devices of the same type. So we have these 4.5 grand machines that we buy for our developers, right? And they have 64 gigs of RAM and CPUs out the wazoo and 2 terabytes of solid state disk and all this wonderful stuff, right? Is Bob's one any good? Like Bob says his machine is slow. Is Bob just, you know, crazy, or is Bob very perceptive? Is his machine actually slower than others? So if we have, you know, more than 3 of these machines, we have dozens or hundreds or thousands potentially of these machines. Is this a good one or a bad one? Can we identify machines that vary from the norm for that particular make and model of that particular spec? And when you're talking about getting into an effective ham strategy, you're talking about getting beyond the foundational aspects into some quite advanced things. And I think being able to tell that, and then really what we're talking about is trying to leverage the warranty from the manufacturer as much as possible. So if I can prove to Dell that this particular Dell whatever sucks, I might be able to actually get that replaced, or I can identify that, you know, there's hardware alerts coming from the hard disk, or the battery is not you know, is drained its effective use faster than it absolutely should. So these are going, you know, these are not 101 sort of concepts on ham. These are really relatively advanced, but really what we're trying to do is get the maximum. We spent that 4.5 grand and we want to get the maximum lifespan and usage out of that device as a result. And if that means I've got to go back to the manufacturer and say, hey, the battery on 50 of these 500 machines has drained far faster than it should, we can get that replaced under battery warranty in the first year or first 3, depending on how you got it configured. Or these devices are really poor examples of their thing, or other devices with the same, you know, you can sometimes, it's not just about an individual device, but it's about making decisions on purchasing. Which devices comparatively are better or worse in real use, and actually have canonical data-driven data to prove this. We did a thing with our exec team. We were looking at different models that we were considering getting for them, and they all had roughly the same specs. Some from HP, some from Dell, some from Lenovo, whatever. We were looking at different models, and you know, their prices would vary a little bit here or there as well. But which ones are actually the best? Which ones boot fastest? Which ones drive less frustration? Which ones have, you know, they both have the same, or there's 5 of them and they all have the same Intel processor, but do some of them actually seem to execute processes faster? Do some of them actually function better? And because we have that data, we can feed that in, and that's a really effective ham strategy. That's making intelligent decisions before you buy machines on bulk. That's leveraging the warranty for devices more effectively. That's being proactive in terms of getting to repairs and fixing problems, hopefully under warranty for free, essentially, before it really hits the user. There's lots of things you can do if you have a wealth of data to drive different ways of looking at ham, I think. And that's what I think is, and that's DEXy.
Yeah. First of all, I love that. That's such a great, you know, good stories that connect the ideas, and a really good perspective there. Tim, you had a response to that.
Yeah, I just
Yeah,
wanted to elaborate on something Jason said around leveraging warranties. I mean, we've got a customer, and Jason, I think, will know who it is. And they've done a lot of that around battery health. So that's typically just basically ignored. I mean, batteries will degrade over time, and by the time you need to replace a battery, typically it's out of warranty. But by just doing battery health checks and actually leveraging that warranty while those devices are in warranty, it's a significant impact. And obviously, from an end user point of view, when you replace their battery and all of a sudden they've got a device that is performing fantastically again, it gives them a big smiley face. And those are real world examples of how this tooling can actually assist in terms of improving employee productivity.
Yeah, those are, I love the real world examples, right? That, that's the core, right? Is like, the theory, but then actually how it happens in the real world. So thank you for bringing that perspective forward. So, one of the ways that obviously when we're talking about hardware asset management, if companies don't have a strategy on that, it's really about how do we just keep the devices as long as humanly possible. So that leads us to our next question. And with this one, I'll start with Jason, which is how can companies ensure they are getting the most out of their hardware without affecting employees by sweating their assets for too long, without just like extending the life until these things die? What are your thoughts there, Jason?
A lot of it relates to the same data. So that example I gave of, the person on reception, not stressing their device, or the person that might be hammering their CPU and having the wrong device because they're getting frustrated by not having it. Essentially, if we can understand, how frequently users are stretching the performance boundaries of their machines, if they're not stretching them ever, then the machine is definitely sufficient, maybe too good, but if there's such a thing, right? But if they're hitting it, it shouldn't matter the too long bit or sweating the asset. I mean, it shouldn't matter whether a user's had a machine for a week or 5 years. What should matter is that the user has a machine where they can effectively do their job without the machine slowing them down. And if the machine doesn't matter if it's a week old or 5 years old, if the machine is getting hammered from a CPU perspective continually, or RAM is always running out, or we've no disk space, or all the basics, right? Then it's not a good machine for the user. If the machine has the right amount of disk space and the user doesn't run out of RAM or bump off RAM limitations, if the CPU is never stressed out, then it doesn't matter the machine is 5 years old.
Right.
So, that's again data that is available with our DEX platform, for example. So it is again this marriage of DEX and ham, cheese and ham. And I don't know, should we do the cheese? I'm not sure. But but basically we're cheesy. But that's how if you can eliminate those points of friction, or identify those points of friction, and then use a smart hardware asset management strategy to eliminate them. In other words, by getting the users who need new machines, but also that machine that's a week old, that the user's really frustrated because they keep on, hitting it's only got 8 gigs of RAM and then a processor from an old sock. If that's there, maybe there's another user in the organization where that would be a perfectly appropriate machine for them to be using, because they're not trying to compile software on it. The fact that they've got 8 gigs of RAM is plenty. Doesn't need, but if that user needs 64, it's not the right machine. So you can also look to play swapsies. And I spoke with a customer that Tim works with as well, and they raised a lot of issues around, the human elements of that. Will somebody be satisfied if they get a new machine and it's not a new machine, right? And that's all the human elements or whatever. But from a pragmatic, practical approach, and often, they're not bad machines or anything. It's just, here's a machine that somebody else previously used. The machine I use has had two previous owners, one of which is David, who's on the call. So it's and I don't mind. It's a good machine.
Did you two just swap machines, or what?
There you go.
Yeah, well, I couldn't go down to Cape Town to get yours, so I just took David's.
Perfect segue. David, what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on like the concept around doing more than just like sweating them to their like the last drop?
Yeah, well, I think, we've spoken a lot about looking at the data on the machines and how the machine is performing. But we've got other sources of data as well. And one of the key ones is our ITSM, our IT service management tool. How many times has a user logged an issue on that machine? So we want to be proactive. We want to fix things in advance. I don't think many companies are in a situation now where everything is perfect all the time because of this automation. So there will be tickets raised. There will be issues. We can look at how many times has this machine had an issue, and what's the impact on the user? Because we might fix it quickly, but if an issue occurs, how much does that affect the user to log that issue, to take time, the technician, to maybe swap the machine out and all that sort of stuff? And sometimes you might just say, look, this machine, it's had, the UK residents will know the triggers broom joke. It's had a new handle, it's had a new head, it's had all these sort of things over and over and over. perhaps it's just time to put that machine to one side. So really look at your data in your ITSM, speak to your teams working on those. What are they having to do? How many times are they having to put hands on kit? And make sure you incorporate that into that asset and say, well, no, this asset is now done, time to replace with a new one.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, again, going back to leveraging the warranty, right? So
yeah,
we track when machines get re-imaged. So it was called PC1 when Bob had it. Bob had loads of problems, gave it back to IT. They gave him a new machine. They wiped it. It's now called PC2 and it goes to Mary, right? If that machine has got some fundamental issue on the motherboard or whatever, it's not going to last Mary particularly long either. And again, it may well be within its warranty period. It may only be a few months old by the time it gets wiped and reloaded again and handed off to somebody else. And if you keep on doing that, we can actually track that happening. And we will automatically flag the machine as being for replace because it's been wiped and reloaded too many times. The indicator is that there's some fundamental issue with this. If you then go to Dell or HP or Lenovo, whoever your vendor is, and say, look, we've wiped and reloaded this machine 6 times in the last 7 months, and it's always problematic. We've given it to 6 different users, and it's always problematic. We want you to replace this machine. You have the data to have that conversation. A lot of the times when a machine gets wiped, it's a new machine to any and all tools and brains consideration. So you don't know. Well, I happen to know that's actually the reason why I know my machine used to be David's machine, right? Is that I know the history of the machine because we have it. There's no way I could tell. He didn't etch his name into it with a compass or anything. Like, there's no way I could tell that used to be David's machine without that kind of information. So if you can't track that, how do you know that's the machine when you have 25,000 machines? That's the machine that's been wiped and reloaded and passed a half a dozen users in the past year. You don't have that information normally. So having that really is powerful as well. Again, get the most out of your warranty, get the most out of your spend, get a new machine, and hopefully it's not going to be problematic again.
That's a really good point. Like understanding and being able to track it past multiple reimages or wipes. That's something I hadn't thought of. Yeah, that's a good one. Tim, do you see that at all? Or what are your thoughts on this point here about sweating assets?
Yeah, I mean, obviously sweating assets is a good business practice as long as the device is still performant. One of the challenges, though, is when devices go out of warranty, some of the vendors don't allow you to use their kind of networking tools to upgrade BIOSes, for example. So what we've seen in the past is customers will maintain a refresh cycle so their devices remain in warranty so they can manage the devices effectively. And again, I think that's, although at face value sounds like a great practice because obviously you want the kind of least path to resistance in terms of ensuring that a device remains healthy. And obviously you want to ensure that your BIOSes are up to date for security purposes and manageability purposes. But actually, and again, we've got a client that uses the platform, the 1E platform. I work with 1E a lot. And they use Dell's like manual utilities, but they've orchestrated those manual utilities that you still get from the vendors. You just can't automate them through the vendors' utilities. And they've got devices that are kind of 7, 8 years old that are still getting updates from the vendors. They're just not getting it through the automated vendor process. So using the technology at hand, don't just use kind of devices out of warranty, for example, as a decision to refresh because that's a manageability issue. You can use the platform to still manage those devices and still ensure they're updated. So yeah, that's the only thing I'd like to add from that perspective.
Well, I mean, yeah, that one's great, and that's a really great segue to the next question here. Is obviously that strategy is beneficial to the manufacturer, but when it comes down to costs and understanding real costs, David, I'd like to start with you on this one. Like, what are the cost saving opportunities in hardware lifecycle management? Like, where do you see saving 1E money with a ham strategy?
It's again covered in many ways by the conversations we're having here. Look, making sure we don't have piles of kit lying around that's unused, making sure people have the right kit. If we've got this person working on reception, as Jason mentions, with a 4,500 piece of kit when they could have a 1,000, we've wasted 80% of the cost straight away there. So we've got some cost saving opportunities in that space, but equally again, as long as we're managing our hardware assets in their life cycle, we've got the opportunities about sending kit out, getting it back in, not going through those constant replacement cycles. If we've got it past the manufacturer's warranty and we're trying to do the repairs and updates ourselves, that can be expensive and time consuming. And maybe we're only having to do those because the device is inappropriate for that person and it would be better suited with someone else. And again, looking at our tool, which would tell us whether it needs to be repaired, replaced, or whatever, we can choose the appropriate strategy for each and every device. I think also, cost saving. We spoke about the time that people take when there's a problem with their device and the effort it causes them. And so it's not really cost saving, let's call it cost avoidance to the company in that space.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm going to save Jason for last for this one because I know he's done some deep work in the ROI analysis. But Tim, where do you see this? Where do you see cost savings, opportunities?
Obviously, kind of negotiations with vendors around bulk purchases, standardization of kit, those kinds of things. I mean, one thing that is close to my heart, I suppose, is around energy efficiency. I mean, we all know that when you're putting new devices in, typically they are more energy efficient, but that then is a trade-off around, do you need that new device because potentially you could be repurposing an existing device. So that is a trade-off, and it's a bit of a double-edged sword. But obviously from a cost point of view, and maybe let's even talk about carbon emissions. When businesses report carbon emissions, they normally have to report scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. I don't want to get too technical, but scope 2 emissions are energy use. And scope 3 emissions, which aren't mandatory from a reporting point of view, are things like capital goods purchase. So what we're finding is that a lot of companies have now done as much as they can around reducing their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and they're starting to focus on their scope 3 emissions, which is their broader supply chain, let's call it that. So sweating your assets actually reduces your scope 3 emissions from a capital goods point of view. So there's any number of opportunities from a cost savings perspective. I think you've just got to kind of weigh up the pros and cons of each.
Awesome. What are your thoughts here?
We have a customer who manufactures clothing and sporting goods. Okay. I was talking to them about device refresh and hardware asset management 4 or 5 weeks ago, and they said that the carbon cost element is more important to them than the dollar cost element.
Oh, okay.
Right? That for them as a business, they've committed to getting to net zero or whatever by a date, 2026, whatever it was. So basically, they were saying that the carbon. Now, when we look at cost savings, we look at cost savings from it's depending on the machine type or whatever, it's $1,000 or it's $4,500 or it's whatever for the device. And obviously you can avoid that. To David's point, it's cost avoidance rather than maybe cost saving, but you can push that out. If you push it out of the calendar year, it's a saving in that year. But the carbon saving, the average laptop is 326 kilos of carbon to produce in terms of, when you dig the rare earth out of the ground to make the battery, and when you start mining the aluminium or aluminum, depending on what part of the world you're in, to make the case and all that kind of stuff, and then you build it and ship it and everything, and it lands on the user's desk, it's typically, the average is 326. It varies, and all manufacturers now need to give their product carbon footprint, their PCF data. Typically lowest is 300 and highest 400, but 326 is the average. The typical lifetime of a laptop in terms of consuming energy is less than 100 kilos. If you have it running 24/7 and leave it in all day, every day for 10 years, it's going to eat about 100 kilos. And a newer one would be 100 kilos. An older one might be 120 kilos, but it's 20 kilos out of a 326 kilo manufacturing thing. So to Tim's point, avoiding the purchase altogether saves a lot more carbon than, upgrading to get a slightly lower use machine typically. Also, the thing that uses the most carbon is actually your screen. Your monitor uses more carbon than your device. Well,
Wow.
unless it's part of the device, right? But so it's interesting. One of the things, and this is not hardware lifecycle management, one of the things that we're looking at in an upcoming thing is actually looking at applications like Zoom. We're talking on Zoom now, and Teams, and then you have WebEx, and you've got Google Meet, and you've got other things. Which one of those uses the most carbon when you use it? Companies are beginning to focus on things like that, and the reason is there's reporting requirements across the hardware that you purchase, the energy that you use while you use that hardware, and all sorts of different things. So yeah, the scope, and I think scope 3 is required to be reported on by the EU now this year, isn't it, Tim? Not in the EU? No. Okay, just wanted to.
Not.
Okay.
No, it's not, Jason. It's always been 1 and 2 mandatory, and scope 3's always been optional, and it still is, to be honest.
Okay.
That's good perspective, yeah.
But yeah, the cost is the cost of operation as well as the cost of, and it's cost of carbon as well as the cost of dollars, and there's an opportunity to save on both.
Yeah, great points, great points. So now we're talking about the cost savings, we're talking about the concepts, but getting into the details of it, where, Tim, let's start with you. What do you see around the first steps? So what are the first steps in implementing a more DEX-friendly hardware asset management?
Yeah, I'd go about this the kind of same way you typically deploy any sort of business requirement, to be honest. I'd baseline where I was at. So I'd understand exactly what my hardware environment looked like as much as I potentially could. I'd survey my employees around their view of DEX and how IT performs a service. I'd then set some clear project goals in terms of what we're trying to achieve with whatever we're going to do. And then based on that, I'd look at what tools could help me deliver those business goals. So I'd look at the requirements that I'd laid down, and I would go out there and have a look at the tooling that can assist me. I'd obviously then deploy that tooling, and then I'd start to optimize my environment based on what data that tooling could provide, and obviously make what we've mentioned quite a few times, data-driven decisions. Establish some sort of a feedback mechanism, again, in terms of the employees. So surveying the employees in terms of their view of how we're delivering a service, and then it's just rinse and repeat from there. So, I mean, that's how I would approach it. And that's typically how most projects would go, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's great. David, is that how you approach it? Or do you have any, context to add there?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much where you want to be. And, there's this guidance in ITIL, which is start where you are. And so you have to look around and say, well, what have I got now? Because, go out and look at tooling for sure, but maybe you've got some things in-house that you're not using effectively. Maybe there's some things you just need to add on to. So we're talking here about, and Jason just then specifically around, our environmental impact, going into the amount of carbon emissions, etc. Do we need another tool, or have we got something we can just extend? By no means do I want to put people off our 1E product, of course, but there may be some aspects of things that you already can do. Maybe you have this data stored somewhere. Maybe you have these customer communications, these employee communications. You just need to extend upon those. Always important to look, what have I got now? And then certainly say, well, write out the requirements. Do any of these meet the requirements? Then as you go, you've got to constantly evaluate against those requirements as well. Just because you've created a nice project plan, it looks great on paper, that doesn't mean that at the end of it, you've delivered appropriately. So let's constantly check where we are and adapt and change our process as we go to get our best ham out of it. And because we're talking about DEX friendliness, that employee engagement is critical, whether that's done through tooling or whether it's done through direct engagement with the employees, or probably in the best of both worlds, both.
Yeah, I love that. And so, Jason, from the product perspective, right, from the 1E product capabilities perspective and the way you think about it, what are the first steps for you? What do you see when you're working through the kind of workflow?
I just buy our product and use it, but no. I actually would. I was just there checking for some data that I had, and I found it. What David was saying about, using what you have. I spoke going back a couple of years ago. I actually did a survey in person of 19 of our customers, and between them, I gathered 113 different use cases for use, and there was overlap with some of them, and several of them were using the 1E client, the 1E platform for hardware asset management data and so on. I think there was actually 8 of them were using it, 8 of the 19. It's nearly half, but not quite. And that's typical. So there may well be people, are existing customers of 1E on this call right now, that don't know that they can actually use the tooling they have today to provide some information in this area, or they may have a license for refresh, or if not, might just add on that license and then be able to do a lot more with it. So I think David mentioned getting requirements, right, identifying what you want to achieve, and then I think everything that Tim said in terms of planning it out and implementing it, and one of the things that Tim mentioned as well was the user feedback and surveying and getting responses. I think that's really, really important, and it's a DEX friendly hardware asset management thing to do, if you will. But I think it's something that's often overlooked by any sort of hardware asset management strategy, is actually asking the users or getting feedback from the users about what they think about their devices or how they're behaving or whatever. And that should feed into whether we should buy more of that type of device, for example, which is a very ham type of problem to solve, right? Should we buy more of those? Everyone who has them, we asked, and all the users with that type of device hate them. Well, maybe we shouldn't, or our average is an 8 out of 10 for people liking it, but all of the people with that model, they score it at 3 out of 10 on average. Don't buy more of that model. It's so asking users for their opinion can really benefit a ham thing, because there might be another model that's the same price or cheaper that has a much higher preference score. So if you don't ask, you'll never know. So that's a DEX friendly ham thing for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Jason, just to add to that, I think as IT professionals, we love objective measurements, and we typically try to manage that way. But getting that subjective view from the end users and kind of marrying them together in a single pane of glass is immeasurably valuable, to be honest, because we may think we're doing a fantastic job because we've got 99.99% uptime, but back at the ranch, the end users do not think the same, and it's very critical to get that feedback from the end users.
I just want to come in there, because we can measure all this stuff, right? We can measure this 99.9%, but we can't measure how it makes people feel. We can't measure whether it's silver or it's black, and people care about that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. And if the cost is the same to us or ever so slightly different, maybe it's worth us going for the silver ones because people prefer them. And you're sat for 8-10 hours a day in front of a device. We're talking about laptops, but it could be screens as well. It could be the keyboards people have got. What makes people happy? Because happy people do a better job.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Happy people do a better job. Maybe we can talk about an ad campaign around that. I like that. So we are close on time. We got 2 more questions. The next one is about real world stories. So let's keep this one a little short, and then we'll finish it up at the end here. So can you share some real world examples of successful integrations of a hardware asset management and digital employee experience? And I'm going to start with, put you on the spot, Tim. You're first on my screen, so let's hear it. Tim, like some real world examples. How do you see this?
Yeah, I've mentioned a couple already around optimizing warranties, kind of checking battery health. Funny enough, that same client also checks disk health. It's less of an issue now with SSDs, but they have replaced disks under warranty because of checking how disks are performing. I've had a few customers that have really improved their CMDB. In fact, almost using the DEX solution, the platform, 1E platform, as like the base layer of their CMDB data. So it's almost like the final point of truth. And these guys will have data coming in from SCCM, from Snow, from all over the place. But actually, the data they find the most reliable is the platform, and it's because largely, well, it's real time. And that's obviously very, very valuable because it allows them to improve service delivery. It allows them to reduce mean time to repair because they know where things are and what are on those devices. I think those would be some of the main ones. Other examples is, I mean, I live in South Africa. Theft of memory is an issue, and understanding baselining what is on devices, and when that device comes back online and that device is now out of kilter with what its spec is, we can flag those kinds of things up. Let me think of some others. The other one would be maintaining the health of devices through kind of desired state type of stuff. Okay. Historically, we know of guaranteed states. That is really, really important. When a device comes on the network, what are its settings? Has it got the correct antivirus? Is a firewall enabled, et cetera, et cetera? And if they're not, just fix it. I think those would be the main things that I've seen through some of my clients.
Great. And Jason, I know you speak with customers every day or multiple times a week at least. Do you have some real world examples that you could share here? And then we'll get to David on some examples about how he's doing it at 1E.
Sure. I think the foundational piece of data, we've mentioned it a few times, but it's critically important. And you mentioned CMDB, Tim. You know, just even knowing which users have which machines is a challenge with tools like Intune. I mean, Intune records the primary user of the device as the person who enrolls it. So that's like the IT guy most of the time, not the user, and almost never the user, right? And if the user changes, it doesn't change. So if you know, if somebody starts, well, the primary user on my device is now me, but when I first got it, it was David because he had been the previous user, right? But the primary user changes over time because the device's user changes over time. So you have to be able to track and understand that, and it's a foundational element of HAM to know who has which device. Like this kind of stuff is crucial. I've seen customers report, and it is to David's point, it is cost aversion. Rather than anything else. But I've seen customers reporting savings literally in the tens of millions. This is not customers with hundreds of thousands of devices either. We're talking like 32,000 is what I have in mind. And they've literally saved or offset tens of millions. They've essentially, instead of retiring 8,000 or 9,000 devices in a year, they literally only retired 600 or 700 because they didn't actually need to retire any of them. But the warranty was not, you know, the fact that they were going for 4-year recycle, so we 25% of 32,000, right? So do the maths, like 8,000 machines, and they didn't essentially. They just averted them. I think got rid of 600 or 700 because they really had foundational problems with the machines. They needed to get rid of them. They were not suitable for any user. Toss the device. But that's a saving of millions, and it's not. It's a few hundred per user per year when you multiply it out, but very significant numbers, and all the carbon benefits that goes with doing that as well.
Yeah, the great examples. I mean, the skipping the cycles, or at least minimizing the amount that are cycled out, and then carbon, the sustainable piece is obviously important. David, any like anecdotes or stories and some real world examples of how you're implementing it at 1E?
Well, I'd actually like to go the other way if I can, and
Sure.
give you a bad example. And okay. I used to work at a multinational travel company, and we had 25,000, something like that, devices, and we had that very fixed strategy for they will be replaced at 4 years, and that is it. And not only that, it did not take into account users at a granular enough level. We had personas. These are the people that work in this part of the business. These are the people that work in this part of the business. But they could be doing very different jobs, even working out of slightly different locations. It would change their workloads, how they operated. And what you end up is you're replacing people's devices, and you immediately then get people saying, well, actually, I liked my old device better. And think of the DEX impact on that. No, you've now got this one for 4 years. And that's really demoralizing for people. And it was very much that HAM was done to people, not with people. And that's not a good way to do it. Of course, IT have to drive a lot of this, but they have to do that in combination with other teams, talk to people, understand people's needs, and yes, use the technology to do that as well. But you know, I've said it quite a few times through this discussion, but it is about people. So let's talk to people and understand what they think as well. And yeah, it was really demoralizing to be involved in that kind of large, unnecessary refresh in some places.
Great. You know, like I love hearing that, especially as a customer of your team. I love hearing that it is about people, and the whole people aspect in digital employee experience, I think is really core. With that, we're at time. You know, I want to thank everybody for participating. We got quite a few attendees online. Tim, Jason, David, thank you so much for your perspective and your input. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out. You can contact us at 1e.com. And thank you for participating and viewing and interacting today. It's been very enjoyable, and we look forward to the next one. I will say one last pitch here is that, you know, if any of this resonated, I highly recommend you reach out to 1E. Talk to us about our device refresh solution, get a demo. It's extremely powerful. We've had a lot of customers have a lot of really good results from it. Jason's put together a really wonderful product that a lot of our customers are loving. So if you stuck along this long, definitely you're the person who needs to reach out. And thank you for the dozens of you that have. This has been wonderful. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time.